You drift gently into a cold stone corridor where the torches barely hold their flame against the damp. The year is 1602, and the grand halls of Richmond Palace echo not with laughter nor song, but with the sound of soft footsteps, careful, deliberate, slow. And there, in the pale hush of evening, walks a woman draped in white. Her hands are clasped before her. Her face is pale, nearly the same color as the pearl-like ruff at her neck. Her lips do not move. Her eyes are fixed on something far away, far beyond the carved oak doors and painted ceilings. She is Queen Elizabeth. Not the brilliant virgin queen of war and victory, but the last winter form of her weary, silent, heavy with thoughts she will not speak. She will. At 69 years old, she is still England's sovereign. Still unmatched in her knowledge, her command of court and country. But something is different now. Different. She does not sleep. Not anymore. Nights stretch into days, and days into a kind of waking dream. The bed, once a place of rest and ritual, sits untouched. Pillows remain perfectly arranged blankets, smooth as parchment. She walks instead, and walks and walks. Some say she is mourning, others say she is waiting, but none dare ask her directly. For though the queen grows frail, her silence holds more power now than any command she ever issued. Her ladies-in-waiting whisper behind doorways. Servants glance toward one another, but say nothing. Even the counselors, those most accustomed to her fire, find themselves stepping more softly. The air in the palace is thinner now, as if time itself is holding its breath. In the gardens, the trees have long lost their leaves. Winter sits heavy upon the land, pressing in against the glass of every window. But inside, it is not cold. No, something far stranger fills the queen's chamber's warmth without comfort. Light without joy. A strange, uneasy hush. A flickering candle sits by her chair, and its flame trembles, though no wind stirs, as if even the fire is unsure of what comes next. Outside, the River Thames moves slowly, sluggish from the ice forming near its banks. And inside, Elizabeth continues her silent patrol, draped not in the finery of state, but in plain linen and weary lace. She has shed the armor of queenship. No crown, no jewels, no speeches. Only the weight of a long life and a silence that speaks more than words ever could. Occasionally she pauses at a window, not to look at the view but to look through it, past it, perhaps to see something or someone long gone. The candle flickers again, and this time it almost goes out, but it does not. Not yet, for the queen is still breathing, still walking. Still waiting, for what no one knows, not yet, and so the palace waits with her. Quiet as snow, still as memory, wrapped in velvet and uncertainty. The reign of Elizabeth is not over, but it is changing. Softly, like a curtain falling at the end of a play, or the last note of a lullaby fading into sleep. It is the coldest winter in memory. Not because of snow or storm, but because Richmond Palace, once a place of life and ceremony, has fallen utterly still. No music echoes through its grand halls. No courtiers whisper behind their fans. No steps race down marble staircases. Only silence, and in the center of that silence sits the queen. Wrapped in a white shawl that falls like snow over her thin shoulders, Elizabeth sits in her high-backed chair near the hearth, though the fire burns low and unattended. She does not speak. She does not eat. She does not sleep. The women around her, her most trusted ladies, do their best. They bring warm broth in gold-edged bowls. They fluff her pillows, light the fire, open the windows in the morning, and close them again at night. But Elizabeth notices none of it. Or if she does, she gives no sign. Once she would have laughed at them gently, perhaps teasing them for fussing. Once she would have brushed off illness with a biting remark or a proud toss of her hand. But not now. Now there is no laughter, not even a breath of amusement. The Queen has turned inward, and no one knows how to reach her. She has moved her court here to Richmond, and yet she sees no courtiers. She refuses council meetings. She signs no papers. She simply sits, watches, waits. Her fingers tremble slightly as they rest in her lap. Her once sharp eyes, famed across Europe for their command and cunning, now drift unfocused, as if searching for something across a faraway sea. The gardens outside her window bloom only in memory now, and inside, the warmth has gone. Occasionally, one of her attendants dares to speak. A gentle question, a suggestion for a walk, a soft reminder that spring is coming soon. But Elizabeth only blinks slowly, as if such things belong to another world. A world she has already left behind. Some say she is grieving. Others say she is unwell. But beneath their whispers lies a deeper truth. They're afraid that the Queen is not merely tired or sad or sick, but that she has already begun to leave them, piece by piece, memory by memory, step by step. And still she does not lie down. Still she does not weep. Still she does not speak. It is said that when Elizabeth entered a room in her prime, all light bent toward her, that her laughter could charm an enemy, that her presence alone could settle unrest, still rebellion, and stir a kingdom into loyalty. But now she has become like a ghost of herself, paler than parchment, quieter than breath. Her ladies remembered the time she danced in jeweled gowns, when she spoke Latin with ambassadors, and played the virginals late into the night, when her court was the envy of every king in Europe. Now those memories hang in the air like fading perfume, hints of what was, shadows of what may never be again. They speak in hushed tones behind closed doors. They write to physicians, to advisors, to anyone who might know what to do. But what does one do when a queen decides to leave the world while her body still remains? As the days pass, no one dares laugh, no one dares hope. Even the dogs in the courtyard seem quieter now. Even the birds do not sing. Winter has settled on Richmond, but it is not the frost outside that troubles the court. It is the frost behind the Queen's eyes, and the chilling thought that perhaps it will never melt. Time, they say, heals all wounds, but some wounds do not fade. Some fester silently in the heart, untouched by years or reason. In the quiet corners of Richmond Palace, where dust gathers on carved beams and the scent of lavender has long since faded, there lingers the echo of one name: Essex, the Earl, the favorite, the traitor, the man she had once loved and the man she ordered to die. Elizabeth does not speak of him. No one dares to. But in her eyes, when they wander beyond the window panes or stare into the cold embers of the fire, he is there. Robert Devereux. The second Earl of Essex had once been the golden figure of the court. Charming, impulsive, daring. Too bold by far, too proud, too reckless. But she had loved him, not in the manner of fairy tales. Elizabeth allowed no such sentiment to define her. but in a way far more complex, as a symbol of her youth, of vitality, of mirrored brilliance. He had made her feel alive, and he had made her feel betrayed. Years earlier, he had disobeyed her orders in Ireland. He returned without permission. He stormed into her chamber unannounced, finding her without her royal paint, barefaced and vulnerable, and she never forgot or forgave. In time, Essex raised an armed rebellion, small and doomed, foolish and theatrical. He was arrested, tried. And then Elizabeth signed the warrant, the one that would see him beheaded on the Tower Green. But history rarely tells of what came after, of the Queen's grief, of the days she spent alone, of the ring, the one he had tried to send her in a plea for mercy never reaching her, of how when she discovered that failure, something inside her seemed to collapse. That was 4 years ago. Yet still in her silence, she listens to him. They say she speaks to shadows now, that she sits in her chair and murmurs softly to the empty air. And sometimes her voice trembles, not with illness, but with longing. Does she see him? In the firelight. In her dreams, no one knows. But the grief has carved itself into her bones. A queen who had once stood firm against armies, against parliament, against suitors, popes, and time itself, now seems unable to stand against memory. She wears no black veil. There is no mourning procession, no name on her lips. But Essex is here. In every step she does not take. In every night she does not sleep. In every word she chooses not to say. For in killing him she may have severed the last thread between herself and the world of the living. Now she floats between two realms. Still queen, but no longer ruling. Still alive, but no longer living. And each night the shadows grow longer, and the silence heavier. In her youth, Elizabeth had been a vision of strength, wrapped in silk and strategy. Golden-haired, sharp-eyed, commanding. She crafted her image as carefully as any general planned a campaign. Every ruffle, every gem, every curl was chosen with intent. She was not just queen. She was Gloriana, a symbol, a myth in the making. But myths do not age well, and queens, for all their crowns, are still mortal. By the winter of her life, the queen refused all mirrors. None were allowed in her chambers. Even the smallest polished surface was draped with velvet. Her maids knew the rule: no reflections, no reminders. And still, Elizabeth painted her face. With trembling hands, she applied the white lead powder that had once dazzled ambassadors and poets alike. It cracked now, no longer smooth. It clung to skin that had grown thin, where veins showed like rivers beneath parchment. But she did it anyway, for herself, for the legend she had created, for the world she had ruled. Yet she never looked to see what the world saw, never dared. They say she sat for hours in her chair, still, as a statue, hands folded neatly, lips tight with concentration. When her ladies asked if she might like to lie down just for a moment, she shook her head almost imperceptibly. No, to lie down was to accept something, to yield, to admit that the flame was growing dim. Elizabeth would not do that, so she remained upright, as if posture could hold off the inevitable, as if sitting tall meant death could not find her. Outside, snow fell gently across the stone terraces. Inside, her limbs ached. But she refused. Warmth refused blankets, refused even the suggestion of weakness. She had survived assassins, defied popes, outlasted kings. She would not let frailty be her final act. But there was a cost. For though the mirrors were hidden, time does not ask permission to change a face. It slips in quietly. Lines deepening, bones thinning, eyes dimming. And in avoiding her reflection, the queen seemed to lose more than just her image. She lost a tether to reality, to herself. Her ladies whispered that she no longer knew what year it was, that she repeated words under her breath, words that made no sense. Or perhaps they did, long ago, in a court that no longer existed, among voices that had long gone silent. At times, she mistook one maid for another. Once she had dressed a girl as Cat Ashley, her childhood governess dead these many decades. They humored her, not out of fear, but of love. For they knew that behind the silence was the mind of a woman who had once ruled the fate of nations, and who now could barely rule her own hours. One evening, one of her ladies, young and kind, and foolishly hopeful, asked gently, "Your Majesty, do you miss your reflection?" Elizabeth did not answer, but after a long moment she lifted a hand to her cheek where the powder had begun to crack. She touched the edge of it, then lowered her hand again, and said nothing more. Outside, the sun set behind Richmond's towers, and inside, the queen continued to sit upright, unsleeping, unseen. The mirror refused her. Or perhaps she refused the mirror. Either way, it no longer mattered. What she saw now was not her face, but ghosts, and they did not care what she looked like. The queen had once inspired awe in the most learned men of her realm. She could quote Latin better than the bishops argue statecraft with diplomats, and silence a quarrelsome court with a single look. But now the learned men of her kingdom stood at the foot of her chair, helpless. Physicians came and went, called from London, from Oxford, from the royal household itself. They arrived with scrolls of knowledge bottles of imported tonics, and hands that trembled when they reached for her wrist. But they could not name the illness, because there was none. No fever, no bleeding, no swelling, nor rash, nor cough. Only silence, only stillness. Elizabeth sat upright as always, her breath shallow, her gaze far. She neither spoke nor resisted. But when they reached for her, she pulled away. "I am not ill," she whispered once. "I am tired." That word struck more fear into them than plague ever could. In the 16th century, the science of medicine was still more poetry than proof. Physicians spoke of humors, blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. They measured pulses, inspected urine, bled patients to balance their essence. But none of their practices could touch what had settled over the queen. For it was not the body that was breaking. It was the will. Still they tried. She was urged to eat barley broth, mulled wine, sweetened prunes. She refused them all. They offered herbal teas, chamomile, to calm valerian, to soothe rosemary for the memory. She sipped none of them. They prescribed warm compresses, poultices, and prayers. None had any effect. Her body remained steady, frail, but not failing. And yet, she was fading. One doctor, braver than the rest, suggested she might be suffering from melancholy, a darkness of the mind, a kind of sorrow that medicine could not cure. He was not summoned again, for what monarch could admit to sadness? What queen, built of steel and legend, could confess to despair? Still, the court knew. They saw it in her posture, so rigid it seemed brittle, in the way she flinched from the touch of even her oldest companions. in the long hours where she stared at the fire lips moving, as if in silent argument with someone unseen. Some speculated it was a hidden cancer. Others whispered of poison administered by enemies, or perhaps even an error by her own household. But most knew the truth was not that simple. She was not dying of one thing, but of many. Of age, of grief, of loneliness, of memory. She had outlived her friends, her lovers, her enemies, and her youth. And now the burden of those decades had grown heavier than any crown. The physicians began to sit in silence. They took her pulse. They recorded her temperature. And then they left the room slowly, as if afraid that even the sound of their boots might break what little remained. They stopped trying to heal her and began simply waiting like everyone else. In the gardens, snowdrops had begun to push through the hard earth, early signs of spring. But inside, time had stopped. No remedy could be found. Because this was not a sickness of the flesh. It was the last page of a long, magnificent story. And they could only read it aloud as it came to its quiet end. Richmond Palace had grown too quiet, and in the absence of answers, people began to whisper. It is the oldest habit of court life where knowledge is precious, but rumor is free. And so the rumors came. They said the queen had been poisoned, that some foreign hand, Spanish perhaps, or French, had reached into her very goblet, that one of her own had betrayed her seeking favor from a successor not yet crowned. They said her ladies knew but dared not speak, that her food tasters had vanished, that her physicians avoided her gaze not out of helplessness, but guilt. It was nonsense, most likely, but nonsense has a way of growing teeth in the shadows. And then, of course, came the other theory, older, darker, the return of plague. The year before in London, the sickness had swept through the city's narrow streets, claiming thousands. Even the rats had begun to vanish. The court had fled to the countryside. But diseases do not care for velvet or gold. They slip through doorways beneath gowns behind gloved hands. Some swore they had seen signs, a rash on the queen's wrist, the flush in her cheeks, the way her breath sometimes caught in her chest. Was it the Black Death again? Or something gentler, but no less final? Smallpox had nearly taken her once in her youth. Now some thought it had returned to finish what it had started. Others pointed to the queen's cosmetics, the thick white ceruse paste she had used for decades to keep her face ghost pale. It was known quietly that the mixture contained lead, and lead over time seeps into the blood, dulls the mind, erodes the strength of bones and heart. Could it be that the queen had poisoned herself? Not in malice, but in pursuit of image. In defending the mask, had she weakened the woman beneath it? No one dared ask her, and she would not have answered. Whatever the cause, it was clear to those closest to her that something was changing. She spoke even less than before. She no longer flinched when touched because she no longer noticed. Her lips grew dry. Her hands pale as pressed lilies trembled constantly. Still she refused the bed. Still she would not lie down. Still she watched the fire, as if waiting for a figure to emerge from it. Perhaps Essex, perhaps death. The palace attempted to maintain normality. Tapestries were dusted, meals were prepared, guards took their posts, but everyone knew it was theater. Behind every door was fear, not only for the queen, but for the kingdom. For Elizabeth had ruled so long that no one remembered what it meant to live without her, and should she die tonight or tomorrow? Who would follow? What chaos would rise in her place? Some prayed she would recover. Others prayed only that she would find peace, but no one said it aloud. The queen was dying. Whether by poison, by plague, by age, or by heartbreak, it no longer mattered. The result was the same, and as night fell over Richmond once more, the wind carried not the sound of music or laughter, but the soft, cold hush of the end beginning. There are many ways for a monarch to leave this world. Some go in glory, surrounded by banners and hymns. Some go in pain, their courts frantic with doctors and priests. But Elizabeth chose a stranger path. She simply refused. Refused to eat, refused to speak, refused most of all to lie down. For nearly 4 days and nights, the queen stood or sat upright in her chair, resting only for moments at a time before straightening again. She would not be coaxed to her bed. No matter how gently her ladies pleaded, no matter how many cushions they offered, she refused them all, with a shake of the head or a thin, Ados-like smile. To lie down was to admit what everyone already feared. And Elizabeth had never been one to yield easily. Not to armies. Not to Parliament, not even to time. Her ladies, once young themselves, were now older, though not as old as she, and they tried everything. They sang softly by her side. They brought the gown she had once worn to Tilbury, the golden one that shimmered like sunrise. They spoke to her of May Day feasts of pageants and hunts of bright mornings long past. But her eyes did not flicker. She sat still, unmoved, as if carved from the very throne she had ruled. It was not stubbornness. It was defiance, her final act of will. Even as her body failed her, even as her shoulders slumped and her lips cracked, she held herself upright, a queen to the last. And yet she was not without pain. Her hands would clench without warning. Her breath came in shallow, stuttering waves. She slept in fits, barely minutes at a time, her head nodding before snapping back up again. And the shadows beneath her eyes deepened. Her physicians stood helpless. Her servants, exhausted, took turns watching her through the night. They would find her standing in her chamber at the darkest hour, eyes open, lips barely moving. Was she speaking? Praying, listening? No one could say. But it was in those silent hours, when the rest of the palace lay hushed in uneasy sleep, that they feared for her most, because something had changed. Not in her body, no sudden collapse, no cry of pain, but in the atmosphere itself. It was as if the queen had already begun to depart, not in a rush, but in increments. A slow dissolving of presence. She was there, and not there. Like a shadow in candlelight, never still, never quite whole. On the third night, one of her maids, overcome with grief, knelt beside her and whispered, "Please, Your Majesty, rest. You need rest." Elizabeth's only reply was to lift her hand, trembling slow, and touch the girl's cheek with unexpected tenderness. And then she turned her gaze back to the fireplace, where nothing burned but ash. The message was clear, not yet. Not until she chose, not until she was ready, not until she had let go. But the cost of such strength was visible. Her body thinned. Her voice, already rare, faded to silence. And still, she would not lie down. And so the palace bent around her. Chairs were rearranged, cushions stacked, blankets placed not over her, but beside her, just in case. The queen remained vertical, held aloft not by strength, but by will alone. It could not last. Everyone knew it, but none dared to suggest the end aloud. For as long as she stood, so too, it seemed, did the kingdom. It is said that old palaces remember, that their stones hold memories, like dry parchment holds ink. that in the hush of candlelight, if one listens carefully, the voices of the past may return soft, distant, almost imagined. And in the throne room at Richmond Palace, they had begun to return. Elizabeth no longer visited the throne room in daylight. She had not held court in weeks. But at night, when the halls were quiet and the corridors emptied of nobles, she sometimes asked to be taken there. Her steps were unsteady now, so two maids would guide her arm gently, one on either side, as she crossed the checkered floor. They opened the heavy doors slowly. The room beyond was vast and dim, lit only by firelight and the distant flicker of torches. And there she stood, before the empty throne. The chair was tall-backed, carved with lions, draped in crimson velvet, and crowned with gold embroidery faded from years of wear. No one else sat in that room. No council, no ambassadors, no fools or fawning favorites. Just her. And something else. The guards who stood at the edge of the chamber said they heard nothing, saw nothing, but the Queen. She would sometimes nod as if someone had spoken. Once she smiled faintly, the only smile she had worn in weeks. Another time, a tear slid slowly down her powdered cheek. Not from pain, but from recognition. She was not alone. Not in that room. Not anymore. They had come back to her. Not in flesh, no, but in memory. Or something deeper. Robert Dudley, the friend of her youth. Mary, her cousin and rival. Essex, whose name she had not uttered since the day of his death. Even her father, the great Henry, whose shadow had always loomed just behind her crown. Perhaps they came in dreams, perhaps in guilt, perhaps only in the fragile spaces of her mind where time no longer moved forward. But she saw them, and she spoke to them. No one recorded what she said. No one dared step close enough to overhear. But those who kept watch said her lips moved gently, and her head tilted slightly, as if listening to replies no one else could hear. The throne remained empty, but the room was full, not with people, but with presence. She stayed there for hours, standing or sitting quietly, until her strength gave out. Then her ladies would return, lift her slowly, and carry her back down the darkened corridor. The throne room would be sealed again. But in the morning, servants found strange signs, a candle still burning low, the scent of lavender where none had been sprayed, footprints that led nowhere. It was said among the staff that the Queen had begun to slip between worlds, not yet dead, but not fully alive either, hovering in that gray space where the living remember the dead and the dead. Wait. The Queen had not given her last breath, but she had begun her farewell, not in words, but in presence. And in that ancient throne room, surrounded by ghosts and silence, she stood not as a ruler, but as a memory being written line by line, moment by moment, into the folds of history. Night fell early that evening. Not in the sky, it was still pale blue, streaked with fading gold. But inside Richmond Palace, where every shadow felt longer and every silence rang louder, the Queen had not spoken all day. Not even to her closest maid, nor to the physicians who entered quietly, took her pulse, and left again, with furrowed brows and lowered eyes. She had not eaten in 3 days. She had not slept in 4. And still, she would not lie down. But something had shifted. Even those with no training, no titles, no knowledge of medicine, they could feel it. A kind of hush deeper than silence, a stillness that no fire could warm. The wind howled against the outer stone walls. A storm had come down from the north, unexpected and bitter. Snow clung to the windows. Branches scraped against the leaded glass like fingers from the other side. Inside, servants moved slowly. Voices stayed low. No music was played. The hearths burned only faintly, as if even the flames were unsure whether to stay, and Elizabeth sat as always in her chair by the empty fire. A pale shawl wrapped around her shoulders, though she no longer seemed to notice the cold. Her eyes were open, but unfocused. She did not blink often. She did not respond when spoken to. One might have mistaken her for asleep, if not for the occasional twitch of her fingers, as if writing invisible letters on the fabric of her gown. Letters no one would read. Around her a quiet vigil had begun. Her household gathered slowly one by one. They entered with hesitation, unsure whether it was permitted, but no one stopped them. They stood along the walls, backs straight, hands clasped, eyes lowered. Men who had once argued over Parliament seats. Women who had once danced in her progressions. All still now. All watching. All waiting. Outside, the storm gathered strength. A shutter blew open with a crash, and a gust of snow flurried into the corridor before it was slammed shut again. Within the Queen's chamber, the storm sounded like the sea, and some said later, it was as if the whole of England held its breath. Candles were lit and burned low. No one spoke unless they had to. Even the Queen's lapdog, once prone to yapping at every creak in the floor, lay silent beneath her chair. Then just past midnight, she stirred, a slight motion, barely a turn of the head. Her lips parted. A maid leaned in. They say she heard 3 words, but the maid would never repeat them. She only wept quietly and kissed the Queen's hand. Elizabeth closed her eyes, just for a moment, then opened them again. Not with alarm, but with purpose, as if she had remembered something, or someone. Her hand rose, pointing toward the far corner of the room. No one stood there, but her eyes remained fixed on it, and she smiled, not with joy, but with peace. Then finally, she allowed herself to rest, not to sleep, not yet, but to lean back, her shoulders easing against the chair, her breathing slowing. A woman easing into her own ending with no need for ceremony. And the household waited. No one moved. No one left. It was the longest night Richmond had ever known. Not because of hours, but because of what it held. A queen, a kingdom, and a silence that would last for centuries. By dawn, the storm had passed, but its hush remained inside the palace walls. Snow lay thick upon the gardens, blanketing every hedge and path in perfect white. It was the kind of stillness that made even birdsong feel like a trespass. Inside, the Queen had not moved. Her eyes were open, but dull. Her breathing came slow, yet steady. Her hands, once so swift with pen and scepter, now rested on her lap like fallen leaves, thin, dry still. The court had begun to gather quietly, cautiously. They did not come all at once, and they did not speak of what they feared. Instead, they arrived under noble pretense. A small inquiry about documents, a need to retrieve a letter, a simple desire to pay respects. But behind each polite excuse was dread. Elizabeth had reigned for 44 years. She had seen off invaders, held the line of a dynasty, carried the crown alone, with no husband, no heir. She had become more than queen. She had become England itself. And now the specter of her absence was too vast to look at directly. They paced the outer halls, murmuring in corners. Courtiers who had once jockeyed for influence now asked nothing. No one dared raise the topic of succession. To speak of the Queen's death was to challenge her power, to say aloud that the Virgin Queen Gloriana herself could perish like any other mortal. And so they remained silent. In the council chamber, papers lay unsigned. No proclamations were prepared. No riders were sent. They did not know what to say. To each other, to the people, to themselves. Some whispered of James, King of Scotland, Elizabeth's distant cousin, her presumed heir. But no letter had come. No declaration had been made. For Elizabeth had said nothing, had named no successor, had left no final word. She had always ruled by presence, by being unshaken, undisputed. And now, even in stillness, she held that power. Until she breathed her last, she was queen. And so the court waited. They lingered outside her chamber, listened for every shallow breath, watched her ladies with eyes that begged for certainty. But no one knew. Some feared that speaking her death aloud might hasten it. Others feared it had already come, and they were simply afraid to see it. But one thing was clear. None of them were ready. They had thought her eternal. They had built their lives upon her silence, her control, her survival. And now, as the candles burned low and the air grew thinner, the unspoken truth hung like frost in the hall. The Queen was leaving, and no one, not lord nor lady nor leech, knew how to let her go. In the final days of winter, with snow still clinging to the rooftops of Richmond Palace, they began to come. One by one. In silence, unannounced, not as courtiers or statesmen, but as people. Men and women who had served her through decades. Those who had been loyal, and even those who had at times strayed. They did not come to plead or to bargain. They came to say goodbye, though none would have dared to use the word. They stepped into her chamber quietly, never for long, never expecting reply. Some knelt, some bowed. Some simply stood and watched her, the queen who had once seemed larger than the very realm she ruled, now so still, so small, and yet still commanding the center of the room like a constellation. Elizabeth remained seated, draped in shawls and silence. She did not speak. Her eyes did not always follow the visitors, but no one left unchanged. Some swore she knew they were there, that her fingers moved slightly when they approached, that her breath deepened just for a moment, as if in recognition. Sir Robert Cecil, her most trusted advisor, came first. He stood with hands folded, eyes wet but unblinking. He had served her longer than many had lived. He whispered only one word, Majesty, and left. Then came Lady Scrope, Elizabeth's cousin, and the last of the older generation of women who had once danced and plotted and laughed beside her. She pressed a kiss to the Queen's hand, and for the first time in days, a faint squeeze was felt in return. Just once. Then stillness again. Others came bearing no gifts, no news, only memories, and the weight of unspoken gratitude. Some cried, some could not. A few sat beside her for long minutes in silence, as if offering her the only thing they still could presence. Her favorite musicians were summoned. They did not perform, but one, a man whose hands had once flown across the virginals, now old and trembling, plucked a single string on a lute and hummed a tune from long ago. Elizabeth's brow twitched faintly, as if she heard it not in the present, but in the past. It was not a procession, not a spectacle. No drums, no horns, just shadows moving gently across stone floors. the passing of a court, through the quiet breath of farewell. One night, as the wind howled again, a young page no older than 12 was caught peeking into her chamber. When questioned, he said only, "I wanted to see what history looked like when it ends." No one scolded him, for he had spoken what many could not. This was not just a death. It was the fading of an age. A final chapter written not in fire and battle, but in whispers, in lamplight, in stillness. And all the farewells given were not just for the woman, but for the world she carried with her. Soon that world would belong to someone else, another monarch, another reign, another story. But for now, for these fleeting days, it was still hers. And so they came one by one to offer their hearts in silence to a queen who did not rise, who did not speak, but who even in leaving remained sovereign. The vigil began not with announcement or decree, but with the quiet understanding that time was nearly done. Elizabeth, Queen of England, sat motionless in her chair, her breath shallow, her skin as pale as the linen nightdress she now wore. The fire had burned low. The room was dim, and those who remained knew the sun would not rise for her again. The women who had tended her since youth, those few who still lived, took their places. One sat by her side, gently, holding the Queen's hand, though it barely responded. Another knelt at her feet, reciting prayers not aloud, but silently, lips moving with the rhythm of faith and love. Outside the chamber, the air was thick with anticipation. Every creak of the floor, every shifting candle flame, felt louder than it should. The palace did not sleep. It held its breath, and still, she remained, not speaking, not moving, but not gone. They thought it would come in an hour. Then, too. Then perhaps at dawn. But dawn came, and Elizabeth still breathed. Her body was so still that one had to lean close to hear it. The faint, almost imperceptible sighing of lungs that had once declared war, once whispered secrets to lovers, once commanded an empire. It was a breath not of power, but of release. The sun rose over Richmond, casting long golden beams across the frozen gardens and illuminating the pale folds of the Queen's gown. Still, she did not stir. Throughout the day, the palace remained hushed. No one dared speak of succession. No one dared ask if she had passed. To do so felt like betrayal, like forcing a door to close before it had finished swinging on its own. And so they waited. By nightfall, her ladies had taken turns resting, but one always remained awake, eyes fixed on her, watching for a sign. A change in breath, a motion of the hand, a final word. There was none. No proclamation, no grand farewell, no last flourish of wisdom, just the quiet diminishing of a presence that had once filled palaces, commanded armies, and shaped a kingdom. And then, sometime deep into the second night, when even the candles seemed tired of burning, when the wind outside had quieted to a lull, and the entire world had grown soft with waiting, Elizabeth exhaled. It was not a gasp, not a struggle, just a sigh, like the closing of a book, like the drifting away of a dream. Her head fell slightly to the side, her shoulders eased, and the room knew. Without words, without weeping, the vigil was over. She had gone as she had lived, in silence and dignity on her own terms. There were no trumpets, no royal bell to toll the hour, only the sound of wind in the trees and the quiet heartbeat of history, moving forward. And so the Queen was gone. But you would not have known it, not right away, not from the outside, not from the bells of London which did not ring, not from the couriers who did not ride, not from the court, which said nothing at all, because her death was kept secret, at least for a little while. The ones closest to her, her ladies, her physicians, a few trusted counselors spoke in hushed tones. They did not draw the curtains. They did not remove her from the chair. Instead, they watched and waited. Why? Because Elizabeth had left no clear successor, at least not in writing. And in that pause, in that fragile moment between the end of one reign and the beginning of another, England stood exposed. A single wrong word, a rumor let loose too soon, and the realm might crack like ice. There were whispers of uprisings, of Scottish spies, of old Catholic plots stirring in the dark. If the Queen were dead, and the court fractured, who would hold the crown? So they waited. They prepared her chamber, kept it lit as if she still breathed. Only a few were allowed near. Messages were sent quietly to London, to trusted nobles, to James of Scotland. But outside Richmond no one knew, and inside her body remained where it had fallen, gently, reclined in the chair, her face calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was no public grief, no parade of mourning, not yet. The old Queen who had filled ballrooms with light now filled a room with silence. And in that silence, decisions were made. Sir Robert Cecil, who had long been her shadow in court, moved swiftly. He ensured that James would be informed first that no rival claim could rise in time. He knew that Elizabeth had, in her final days, given only the barest nod toward succession. But a nod was enough. The court agreed to say nothing until James was secured, until the future was stable, until the Queen's final breath could be grieved without fear. It was 3 days before the truth was revealed. 3 days of soft steps and guarded tongues. 3 days where the body of the Virgin Queen lay quietly behind velvet-draped doors as the world outside continued unaware. But when the news finally came, it came like thunder. Church bells tolled across the city. Black drapes were hung from steeples. People fell to their knees in the streets. Some wept, some prayed. Some simply stood in disbelief. For how could she be gone? She had always been there. Like the Thames, like the Crown, like England itself. But she was gone, and in her place, a silence, a space not easily filled. A chapter closed in a book bound in velvet and war faith and fire, loneliness and legend. The Queen who died in her chair without fanfare, without speech, left behind a world that was for a moment afraid to breathe without her. Her death had been secret, but her absence would be impossible to hide. It is the question that lingered long after the chamber fell quiet, long after the throne passed to James, long after the black banners were folded and the bells stopped tolling. What truly killed Elizabeth? No official autopsy was ever performed. Queens were not opened. Their deaths were mysteries wrapped in ritual, sacred, intimate, untouchable. And so we are left with whispers. Physicians of the time suggested she had caught cold, that her refusal to eat, her long hours in icy halls, had left her vulnerable. Perhaps it was pneumonia, perhaps an infection. But they spoke in cautious tones, knowing how little they truly knew. Others, even in their journals, wondered if it was something slower. Cancer, perhaps, of the throat or stomach. There had been swelling in her neck, they said, a strange look in her eyes. But again, nothing was certain. Everything was softened by fear and reverence. Then there were the murmurs about poison, not from an assassin's vial, but from her own mirror. For decades, Elizabeth had worn a mask of white, a thick paint of lead and vinegar ceruse, they called it. It covered blemishes, preserved her youth, but it was deadly. Lead seeps inward. It clouds the mind, weakens the body, drains the life it pretends to protect. Had her beauty betrayed her, perhaps, and yet even that may not be the truth. There are those who believe quietly, gently, that Elizabeth died not from illness, not from poison, not even from age, but from grief, from memory, from the unbearable weight of decades carried alone. She had outlived nearly everyone she had ever loved. Her childhood companions, her advisors, her suitors, her foes, they were all gone, and she remained. A solitary figure, wandering the echoing corridors of a palace that remembered too much. She was not just queen, she was England itself. And when a symbol grows too large, too legendary, the person inside it can begin to fade. She had never married, never had children, never allowed herself to become anything less than an idea. But ideas do not sleep. Ideas do not isomirit. Ideas do not age kindly. And so she sat in her final days, not broken, but finished, complete, as though a long candle had burned exactly to its end. No smoke, no sound, just stillness. Perhaps it was the death of Essex. Perhaps it was the weight of years. Or perhaps after ruling for so long, after surviving treason, war, plague, and loneliness, Elizabeth simply chose to stop, chose to let go. And who could blame her? She had held England together with her hands and her silence. She had made herself legend. She had become myth. And in the end, even myths grow tired. The Queen was gone, but in leaving Elizabeth, Tudor became something greater than sovereign. She became story. She became silence wrapped in gold. She became legend. Her body was finally moved not in secret now, but with the full sorrow and splendor of a kingdom in mourning. Thousands lined the streets of London as her coffin passed, drawn by 4 great horses draped in black velvet, their hooves muffled so as not to disturb the sacred hush. The casket, covered in a cloth of gold pall, gleamed faintly in the gray morning light. Upon it sat her crown, and atop the crown, a single orb symbol of divine right now, without breath to wield it. People knelt in the mud. Some wept. Some touched their fingers to their lips in silence. They had never known a world without her. And now she was returning to the earth quietly, finally. She was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, beneath the same stones that held her ancestors. But she was not buried alone. There, in the dark soil of the Abbey, she was placed in the same tomb as her half-sister Mary. A woman she had once feared, once fought, once followed on the throne. Now forever, side by side, 2 sisters in blood and in crown. Above them, an inscription was later carved. Partners, both in throne and grave. Here, rest. We 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in hope of one resurrection. Time passed. A new king ruled. A new age dawned. But Elizabeth remained in paintings and poems, in the memory of those who had seen her walk through sunlight, like a goddess, cloaked in flesh. She became the Virgin Queen not just in name, but in myth. Untouched, unspoiled, unmatched. She was remembered for her defiance at Tilbury, her speeches that stirred nations, her golden gowns, her iron heart. But beneath the finery, beneath the myth, was always a woman, one who had loved and lost, who had ruled alone, who had whispered to ghosts into the final hours of a long winter. And it is there, in the quiet, in the waiting, in the flicker of a candle nearly burned down, that her story lingers. You can still feel her in the halls of Richmond, in the crackling silence of old portraits, in the way England looks toward the sea and remembers her spine. She is not just in the history books. She is in the hush between sentences, the breath before a new age begins, the echo of footsteps in an empty throne room. Elizabeth did not go out with a roar. She did not fall in battle or in scandal. She simply stopped, and in that stillness, something eternal took root. The woman became legend. The legend became England, and England changed forever.